Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you from sunny Isle of Skye. Well, actually, it's pouring with rain and there's a storm coming in today. So good to be inside today. We got a real good one for you today, actually, about economic incentives and business models. And it's an area of self-sovereign identity that has been, well, there's been a lot of excitement about the technology, let's put it that way. And there's been a lot of innovation, and there's been a huge amount of work on proof of concepts and innovation labs in banks and farmers and telcos, all working with this this new technology. When you try and get out of innovation, you need a thing called a business model, and what we're going to be talking about now with our friends from cheqd is what that looks like in the SSI world. So let me just find my cursor. There we go. And just before we do the intros, actually, for the guys, right back in 2016, Drummond and I wrote the original SSI paper for the Sovereign Foundation. It was called The Inevitable Rise of Self-Sovereign Identity. And in that paper, there was a whole section on incentives. You know, why would somebody run a node on a ledger for this stuff? Why would somebody issue credentials? Why would an organization verify credentials? Everyone needs incentives to participate. So there was a section in there devoted to that. And what we're seeing now is the kind of realization of incentive models. What does it actually mean in the SSI world? That's really what we're going to hear about today. And good to see the chat. Good to see the chat is kicking off, actually, which is excellent. But before we get into that, what I'd like to do is introduce our two guests. So if you haven't realised by now, I'm Andy Tobin, and I look after our business in Europe. And I've been on this SSI gig since well, 5.5 years now, I think. And introducing Fraser. So Fraser, do you want to just give us a quick intro?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Andy, and thanks for having us as well. I really feel to be here. So obviously, Fraser, CEO and co-founder at cheqd. That was from maybe March or April of this year. And prior to that, I was working for Accenture, but mainly working on the Known Traveller Digital Identity project for anyone who's followed that. And that was with the World Economic Forum and the Dutch and Canadian governments. Prior to that, was working with a couple of central banks on cross-blockchain kind of central bank digital currencies on the Jasper Rubin project, again, for anyone who wants to look at that as well. So, yeah.
Right, so you're not new to the world of SSI and credentials, taking this job on there?
Hopefully, by just bouncing around technology, so I've got enough nous and history to be useful here.
Excellent, thanks, Fraser. And Anka, over to you.
Hi, no, pleasure to be here as well, Andy, and thanks for having us. Very excited to talk about cheqd. So I'm the CTO and co-founder along with Fraser, and Andy and I sort of worked and met together back on the, wow, that's a couple of years ago now, on the NHS project in the UK to create
5 years ago. It was about 5 years ago, I think, that we kicked off.
That was about 5 years ago, and I still remember. I think it was Leeds or Manchester, or maybe somewhere, like whiteboarding and coming up with ideas together on the basics of SSI. So I've likewise sort of worked together with Fraser, been in that space for a while. I was also CTO at another startup called IDworks, where we were trying to tackle the problems of how do we have enterprise-ready, interoperable software to handle digital ID. And since then, I've also worked at R3, which is another big sort of blockchain company. So I've been in this blockchain space for a while, as well as the self-sovereign and digital identity space. And very excited to then sort of see where that both evolved for us and how that's guided our idea at cheqd.
Yeah, perfect. So we're going to hear all about that. Oh, hey, Phil Graham is on, actually. Phil was in that meeting in Manchester
Phil.
many moons ago. And actually, that project with the National Health Service, which started off as a little thing, has become a strategic initiative for digital staff passports for the National Health Service. So just shows what you can get up to in Manchester, what happens after a meeting up there. Anyway, let's crack on. Today's format. So we haven't really got like a load of pre-selected slides that we're going to run through. It's a bit more fireside chat like today. And you as the audience are going to play a crucial role, as always. On these webinars, we always get loads of audience questions, which are fantastic. So we're looking forward to seeing a load of those coming in. So if you've got any questions, then we want to hear from you because the guys are here to answer your questions as well as mine. So a bit more fireside chatty and a bit more informal. The cheqd guys have got some slide deck slides ready if we need something to illustrate, but essentially we'll be going through this in a bit more of a relaxed manner. So as I said, the whole thing about incentives and business models, just as a bit of background, I used to work at Telefonica O2, big UK mobile operator. And at any time, the roadmap there, the technology roadmap had, I don't know, 80 items on it. So if you were a product owner and you had your latest, greatest thing, let's call it a self-sovereign identity initiative, and you wanted it to get delivered to end users, you had to fight for your place on the roadmap. And nothing gets on the roadmap unless there's a business model, right? That's just how big companies work. And I'm sure a bunch of you on the call here, you'll be working at large companies. You'll know this, right? You'll be really, you're on the call because you want to, you're involved in SSI somehow. And if you're at a big company, you'll know how hard it is, even at a small company, to get something on a roadmap. And unless you've got a business model and the incentives for the organization, customers, it doesn't get on there, right? So what we've seen over the last 5 years is loads of innovation and excitement and POCs and projects running. There haven't been that many that have crossed into full production rollout. IATA is an obvious example. We've seen the NHS here in the UK. We've seen others around, but not thousands of them, right? So part of the reason for that is the difficulty of getting out of innovation and creating a business model. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you've got any questions, which we hope you do, use the Zoom Q&A. So the chat is looking a bit active already at the moment, which is good. So the chat is just informal chit chat. If you've got any questions you want me to pose to Anka and Fraser, stick them in the Zoom Q&A. We'll cover as many as we can. We've got Alex in the background who gathers them all together in the normal manner. Usually we go long on these webinars, so and loads of people often stay longer. So if you can do, that's great, and we'll see how we get through. So oh yeah, and Anka's got cold and flu, not COVID, Anka apparently. So yeah, if Anka drops off video, it's because he's going to blow his nose or something. So with that, let me just stop the share here and get that ready, and we'll kick off with the main Q&A. So just give us 1 sec.
And thanks for having us, Andy. And I guess to echo what I said earlier, really kind of want to explain a bit more of what we're doing at cheqd, and also kind of, I guess, the history of how we got here. I think we took a crack at it on the Internet Identity Workshop well, last week at some time in the evening. It would be great to kind of do that in an interactive way and take all the questions from actually a much broader audience than the identity group there. Not to say that there weren't excellent questions there, but yeah, really
cool. Thanks, Fraser. Okay, so I've got my windows arranged. Let's kick off. We've got some questions coming in already. Wow. Okay, Vishal is right on the case there. We'll cover that in a bit, Vishal. We got anonymous attendee back. So anonymous attendee does attend quite frequently. So really glad to see that person back as well. So we'll cover that one. Right, let's kick off here. So probably the easiest one actually to start with is just to introduce cheqd. What is cheqd? Where did it come from, and what's the problem you're solving? Fraser, do you want to take that?
I'll take a stab at it, and then Anka can fill in all the gaps that I miss. But I guess the way that we've been explaining it to, I guess, people who aren't familiar with self-sovereign identity is building the payment rails and building the commercial models for authentic data, of which obviously self-sovereign identities is kind of a subset. But what that means for obviously those who are closer to the space is building a layer 1 network similar to the sovereigns of the world, but very much focusing on that kind of payment rail, that commercial model side that we mentioned. So what that starts to look into is we're really focusing on enabling value transfer between individuals, organizations, but also customizing those commercial models around it. So we're really not looking to dictate what those should look like. Really what we're focusing on is creating the toolkit for ecosystems or industries to create their own commercial models. And I think the extension of that is also to make the governance of those ecosystems a lot easier. So almost if you think about what this means from a practical perspective, we're looking to provide those toolkits to make it as easy as possible to build those commercial models out and that governance so that people really aren't starting from scratch. And Andy, up to you if you want to, if I'm able to dive into like how we came about it and the frustrations that kind of bore checked.
Yeah, I think that'd be really good. Just let's do a little bit of history there, actually, because let's do that, and then I want to explore what you mean by toolkits and the sort of nub of the problem that you're solving. But yeah, give us a bit of the backstory.
Absolutely, already. And it was kind of the number of projects that are going to POCs, going into pilots, but kind of never make it any further. And for 3 to 5 years that we were building SSI solutions, that pretty much in every project that we either were directly engaged in or that we were just on the periphery of and had sight of. And it just became this consistent theme of amazing UX. So people would build this, like build the use case, show it to stakeholders, and everyone would be blown away. And that kind of, not the accountant in the room, but kind of whoever holds the purse strings was very much like, right, does it save me money or does it like build revenue? And effectively at that point, no one could answer.
Yeah,
and like Andy was saying, very back to his telephone. It goes back. It just goes to the back of the queue. It just drops off.
Yeah, exactly. You're a bit laggy, by the way. Yeah, so we've seen that so many times as well. We'd be doing really cool SSI projects with an innovation team, and we produced something we thought was amazing, and they'd have lovely demos, etc. And then they get a lot of execs really excited until the accountant in the room says where's the money, and at that point it sort of gets stuck, doesn't it?
Exactly. And I think over that kind of 2-3 year period, we had that frustration again and again. And I think for those on the call who've seen an SSI demo, it's kind of hard to look at the rest of the world with the same eyes once you've seen what it could look like. Like the IATA travel pass, like where you see you can reuse KYC, where you can see you get rid of passwords. Once you've seen that, you can't really go back to the clunky mess that we have now without wanting to change it. So Percy, I'd love to hear Anker's view on this as well. Percy, after about 2 to 3 years of seeing this, just had to go and fix it because it didn't look like anyone else was going to. So that's really where it came from for me, but I'd love to hear Anker's view.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think there's definitely a space for what is called, free credentials, so to speak, or credentials that don't get charged for. And I think it is all towards that broader goal of people should be in some form of control of their attributes or identity that has been checked by someone. But what we quite consistently see is that when you get to the pilot stage, companies start looking at, okay, so it's going to cost me some amount of money to buy this new software and install it. It's going to take me some digital transformation to go change my processes. It's going to take some amount of work associated with changing how we do our internal processes and so on. And while the overall goal of providing people with an ID they control is there, I think there are aspects of it that companies or organizations often find quite challenging. And so where we end up is we end up in the status quo of companies wanting to build their own silos and build their own walls because they can meter and charge that. And I think the reality is, like, to find commercial success, we need to find this balance between privacy and security, as well as making it economically viable enough for every participant in the ecosystem to participate.
Yeah, that's a key part of it, isn't it? Is you look at the various participants in an SSI ecosystem, and if there's no incentives for one of them, then the whole ecosystem can break down, can't it? So how do you see that working when you've got these ecosystems that can emerge and they can be very different to each other, right? If you look at an IATA ecosystem with a bunch of airlines and test labs, that's very different from an NHS ecosystem with a bunch of hospitals and staff, and that's very different from, I don't know, a banking ecosystem doing KYC, right? So how do you see that sort of variety of the different types of ecosystem? Can you have like a one-size-fits-all solution for that? What does that look like from an incentive perspective? Probably Fraser for that one.
Oh, so I think there's probably a latter part that Anker's written brilliantly about called, I think it was like the flywheel of adoption that we've written about. So I'll hand over to him in a second. But I guess to your point around the variety and the customization, I think that's really where we're aiming for. I think I said it earlier, we're really not looking to dictate one commercial model for like the entirety of the SSI world. We're very much looking to build kind of custom, like contract, dedicated tokens, so that each ecosystem can build its own commercial model. If you look to your point around the NHS, I can't imagine a world where the NHS is cross-charging each other for doctor credentials, which just doesn't make any sense to me. However, if those credentials were to move out into, say, private health, that might be something that the NHS is therefore willing to monetize. So I think really what we're looking to do is create things like, we've got some slides that we could throw up, but kind of looking into whether it's subscription models or just cost mutualization, kind of volume-based discounting, but really make it so that you can kind of pick whatever commercial model you want, allow the consortium or the industry to pick who's inside that ecosystem, and effectively pick and choose. And then obviously that data is going to break out. It's going to break out into other ecosystems. And I think we may touch on it later, but I think that's one of the big opportunities that we have is like those combinations of data that we haven't seen yet. And I think where we're looking at, like, when that data does break out into a different ecosystem, there's still a value transfer, but it's maybe transactional rather than hooked into this kind of central customizable commercial model. I'd have to say this really fits.
That is one of the beauties of digital credentials, is that you can jump across ecosystems with them because the user is the API, they take it with them. And suddenly that use case you had over here is generating real convenience or facilitating something for a user that they couldn't do before. But before we go into that in more detail, there are some that would say that SSI, it should all be free, right? It should be altruistic and everyone should just give their time and effort for nothing, right? And credentials should be free and it should be all flowing. I mean, Anker, what do you say to that?
I think there are some credentials that will always be free, and on that sort of like, level of detail, if we think about in day-to-day life, very good examples of things are government issued credentials or government issued stuff because I've already paid for them as a taxpayer, or I might pay a nominal amount for them. Say if I get a UK passport or a driver's license, that covers the cost of issuing that credential, and then that sort of gets given to the person. And in a scenario like that, I can imagine, for instance, the holder of the credential might want to get compensated. But when you think of like an industry like KYC in the financial sector, what we quite often like, the standard user journey for most people is to say, you take a selfie, you take a picture of a passport, your bank then goes off to some kind of API provider, or they have like some people sitting in some back office who check those details and say, okay, this looks like a legitimate thing that we need to do and we can accept. And the reality of a lot of these different scenarios is people are often providing this by proxy in terms of like PDFs or pictures that they're sending along, and then there's some effort or money involved in checking it. And just to put an actual value to it, the simplest sort of like, KYC checks can take anywhere probably in the range of like $5 to $10 to carry out, depending on the geography or the context. If you have something more complicated, like a criminal record check, that could be in the range of like, $50 to $100. And if this is for a company, then, all bets are off. Like, it can be significantly complex to do that. And that's often just the direct cost per check from these centralized ID verification providers. So the challenge that you run into is if you're asking a company to issue the output of that particular check that's been carried out back to the individual, then what's their incentive? Because it's not just going to cost them that $5, it's going to cost them more than that to go carry out like the loaded cost they have associated with it. And it's not a trivial amount. Like if you think of like how much it costs a UK bank like Monzo to maintain accounts for a customer, it's somewhere in the range of, I believe, $50 per year per customer that it takes for them to maintain that customer on their books. And if you imagine that like about like $5 to $10 of that is just the KYC check, and only just the direct value of that KYC check, that's a pretty chunky and hefty amount of like, what it takes to service a particular customer for a year. So our sort of like, hypothesis, and this is what Fraser described as the flywheel of SSI, is if we can reduce that per ID check cost down to the range of single-digit dollars or less than sub $1, then it really massively expands the number of different use cases in which identity or verified identity is used. And at the same time, and over time, what it also does is it reduces the cost of consuming verified identity. So instead of paying $5 per check, if you can get the check done for say 30 cents instead, then it increases the amount of credentials in circulation within the ecosystem. It gives people an incentive to issue those credentials in the first place. And it also, therefore, just increases the number of different places from an individual might get a copy of their data back that they can go use elsewhere. And I think the reason why we describe this as a flywheel is because there will be some inputs over here that are free and should be free philosophically. And there are other inputs which might come from other sectors where there's other bits of authority that is being stamped on by an organization where it makes sense to compensate the issuer of that credential or the holder of that credential. Yeah,
I think we forget that we pay for pretty much all the credentials we've got one way or another, right, already. So, a passport, I can't remember how much a passport is there, 90 quid or something? Yeah, go on, Fraser.
And I think it's exactly the same point. And I think people forget that in the UK, the Passport Office is one of the few places in government that generates a profit. And it's quite a hefty one as well. I think if you look up the figures, it's like it's either around 100 million or kind of multiples of that. And then when you look to kind of the Verify structure that was around a while ago, that was still looking to actually have a value attached to verifications. So even when it's coming from the government, it's still very much being paid for from somewhere. And there's definitely a return on investment calculation that's being done, even when it's the taxpayer kind of creating this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, well, let me just recount some stories of talking to ID verification companies about SSI, right, and issuing credentials. And initially, they looked on it in a horrified manner, right? You say, well, you're going to issue this credential once, you're going to give it to the person, and they're going to go use it as many times as they want. They just see that as being massively cannibalistic, until you say to them, well, what if rather than your narrow set of customers you've painfully gone and got by selling them an API and connectivity and putting some contract in place with them and all of that, which is really hard work. What if your market was suddenly every organization in the world for any use case, and you didn't have to go out there, with salespeople signing all these contracts? Just your customers go and take your data, and you get per click revenue coming in. And suddenly their eyes light up, and it's like, oh, hang on, so this is a different business model. Rather than a per verification, a per authentication, I get paid every time the person uses the credential I give them. And you say, oh, could well be, and their eyes light up. So there's a complete change in business model possible for the ID verification people. Anke, you got your hand up there, which is quite radical. Was that intentional?
Yeah, and I was going to say, the analogy that I make there is credit cards or debit cards. You hold a credit or debit card that is issued to you by your bank. The bank is not individually signing contracts with every single shop or online service or company that you interact with to make that payment. And what's happening is that there's a payment rail in the background that allows the merchant or the shopkeeper that you go to figure out if you have enough money in the bank account, and if that state is true, then know that they can release the goods to you or sell you something, and then the money gets sort of settled in the background. And that's a very, very good analogy, because you control the credit card in your hand. It's literally in your wallet, very similar to an identity wallet. You can go do whatever you want with it. Typically, you don't pay for it unless you're paying for a premium card, which might give you additional features. And when you go spend that, what's actually happening is there's a very rich ecosystem of software providers who allow merchants to accept payments. There's networks in the middle that facilitate that payment, and the bank gets a percentage of the transaction revenue that happens. And that gives your bank a direct revenue stream for why they maintain your bank account. That's why a lot of different current accounts are free and have or enable that model where that happens.
Yeah, I think that is a really good analogy. But if I can poke a quick hole in it, Anke, with credit cards, your bank needs to know where you're spending the money because they're authorizing the transaction. So with a credit card, there is a total correlation capability. Your bank knows everywhere you're using that card, right? It's a bit different for identity credentials, because you need to be able to use your credentials without the issuer knowing everything about them. I mean, that's one of the beauties of SSI. So how do you handle that in a situation where there's a value exchange happening with the credential exchange? How do you protect the privacy of that exchange of the identity information that the issuer should never really know about? Anke, do you want to give us that one?
Yeah, no, I'm really glad you asked that question, because it's probably the question that we've spent the most amount of time thinking about and spending some time on, because it's not just the whether there's a transfer directly made between the issuer of the credential and the recipient, but it's also the cost of the credential. Because what we looked at is you could, as an issuer, probably set a very precise price on a credential to the 9th or 6th decimal place, and then keep a record on your own books and say, this relates to Anke or this relates to Fraser. So if they see that incoming amount.
The price itself becomes a unique identifier, right? So yeah, you can't allow that.
The price itself becomes a unique identifier. So you don't even need a direct transfer. The price itself could become a unique identifier.
Right.
And the way that we want to tackle that is to first blind it by saying the payments between issuers and recipients is never carried out directly. It's only made in aggregate. And partly what that achieves is the fact that the payment itself is coming across in aggregate blends in the multiple, say, recipients and multiple sort of interactions that have taken place.
Right.
So not only are you removing whose credential was it checked, but like it's also you're removing the pricing mechanism, which could also leak the privacy in this scenario. The second piece is, I don't think we necessarily believe in locked credentials as the primary model in which this exchange is carried out. And often when people think of like, you know, commercialized SSI, they think, oh, okay, so you encrypt a credential and then it's only opened up once you make a payment for it. So that might be a model that exists in certain ecosystems, but the reality is we think it's going to be a slightly different model that gets adopted. And the ways we see it working is that instead of charging or locking a credential and then only opening it when you get paid for it, what you charge for is checking if the revocation status of the credential is expired or currently active. And the analogy that I use there, which is sort of like a very different way of like approaching the problem. And the analogy that I give there is, you have a driver's license, which is given to you by the driving license agency. It's a secure plastic ID, you know, that says some things about you, that is issued by a certain organization. And you can show that for free at Sainsbury's or at a grocery store because you're trying to prove your age is above 18, although I'm sure that's a very common problem for you, Andy.
Happens all the time, every day, several times.
Happens all the time, right? And what you're trying to prove there is that your age is above 18. So even if you have an expired driver's license, you can still prove that your age is above 18 because it could have been a valid credential at some point. By the way, when I say revocation status, like the expiry date on a credential isn't enough to say is a credential expired or not, because I could legitimately have a valid driver's license that has an expiry date in 2030, but was cancelled because I lost it or because I changed my address and I never sent it back. Yeah, however, if you wanted to hire a rental car, you take the same driver's license along, they then need to check, is this currently valid? And so they'll do a live lookup with the driving license agency and check, like, you know, is this a currently valid driver's license? So that is one model that we are thinking of as a way in which we can sort of decouple the fact that, like, you know, you are in control of a credential that's been given to you. You can present that to anyone you want. The recipient can check cryptographically, has it been tampered? Is it all of the zero knowledge proofs, or perhaps, you know, you only reveal certain aspects of it. And then it's up to the recipient to figure out, do I want to pay extra in my particular use case to figure out if this credential is still valid? That is the bit that we think is the most valuable aspect of that exchange. Fraser, I don't know if you want to add anything to that over here.
No, honestly, nothing to add. I think that nails it off perfectly. But I guess only to reiterate kind of our priority of, like, yes, we want to make sure there are payments and commercial structures for this, but we really want to make sure that they are done in a kind of privacy preserving fashion. We absolutely don't want to be introducing any privacy leakage as a result of what we're building here. So yeah, just to reiterate your first point around, like, that's really where our priorities lie, is making sure we're not introducing kind of, any leakage there at all.
Yeah, that's really good. I like the idea of, for the higher assurance use cases that are worth more, right, you're going to want to check verification situations. So, but for an age check, maybe it's not so necessary. There's some really good chat going on, actually. Thanks for answering that in real time as well, Fraser, and having a bit of discourse with Jonathan there. Any other questions? There's also questions coming, which is great. So fire in more, and we'll get to them as well. The thing about, let's just clarify the bit about the price of the credential being a correlator. If I issue Fraser a credential and the price to verify that credential is £1.3569 blah 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 pounds, and Anchor's is a slightly different number of pounds, then when I get a payment for the price of Fraser's credential, I know that Fraser has been doing something. So I'll be able to know the payment came from I don't know, Thresher's off license for 80 bottles of vodka, and it was from Fraser, and I know it's from Fraser because the price paid was that amount, right? Then I can associate Fraser with Thresher and 80 bottles of vodka, and I can then start selling Fraser other issues. I can start selling Fraser other maybe self-help schemes and such like. Anyway, but you get the sort of picture. So let's come back a few layers. So we've done the sort of high level incentives here and there, what they might look like, and in how the different components of an ecosystem might need incentives. I want to know what you guys are actually building, right? What are you building? It's great to talk about these tools and things. What are you doing? Who wants to have that? Fraser, do you want to tell us, or should we get the CTO to tell us what he's building?
I was going to say it feels a bit like Anker's area, but I'm happy to build it depending on what he says.
Okay, so I can describe that. So yes. We are building our own DID method. So we had a bit of a journey over there. We started off when cheqd was formed. I think the initial plan was to build this on Hyperledger Indy. And as we started looking at the process of building something out on Hyperledger Indy, there were some aspects of it that we wanted to improve. I think the driving force behind it was to acknowledge the fact that I think Hyperledger Indy has been a massive trailblazer within the SSI space. There's been an immense amount of effort and goodwill that it has in the community. But there were certain aspects of it that we felt could be improved. So the first was the fact that Indy was written before a lot of the DID standards were defined. And so there are certain architectural or design decisions that happen in Indy that aren't completely up to the specifications of W3C, which is fixable. But then we got to the second issue, which is Hyperledger Indy as a public permission network often has a pretty low or narrow tolerance window for how many nodes within which it can work. So I think if it falls below, say 7 nodes, it will stop working. If it goes above 25, it becomes super slow again. So there's a bit of fragility that comes in within the consensus model that is used that we wanted to account for and say, actually, if you're building an SSI solution, then it really should be public permissionless. And the final bit is we wanted to build pretty complex mechanisms. Like I said, we didn't want to impose a single economic model or payment model for the space of SSI, because we just don't think that's a valid user decision to make. It's very likely that different ecosystems will want the flexibility in how they price, how they receive. Maybe somebody wants holder pays issuer, maybe somebody wants verifier pays issuer, maybe somebody wants to just do revocation checks. And we wanted to have that flexibility while acknowledging that because there is no token on Hyperledger Indy, none of the token ecosystem or the DeFi ecosystem is plugged into Indy. So there's an aspect of this where there are no token wallets that Indy would support. Indy is not supported by any exchanges. Indy is not supported by any custodians. Indy is not supported by a whole broad, range of different bits. So the first thing we're doing is we're creating a network that allows this payment to be made. We are creating a DID method that is up to the latest specifications within the W3C standard, and we want to be able to go improve upon that as these standards sort of evolve. And then finally, we are working with partners like yourselves, like Evanim, to create SDKs or software development kits that can be used by SSI developers as well as other app developers to embed this kind of functionality into their software. What we are not trying to do is we are not trying to launch our own app, and we are not trying to launch necessarily our own sort of competing solution on the software side, because we think there's a lot of diversity in the ecosystem of different ID wallets, of different backend software. Evanim sells one, but there are others. And we acknowledge and like that diversity because perhaps there's differentiation in industry sectors, functionality, features, pricing that changes that. So in a sense, what we want to do is we want to become a neutral sort of infrastructure player or provider that focuses on doing one thing and one thing well, which is how do you make that interaction happen where you can compensate the ecosystem. That's what we want to focus on. And we want to enable both the companies, the individuals, and app developers who are building within this ecosystem the ability to pay each other and participate.
Yeah. That's I love that answer actually, because you're sort of clarifying where in the force stack. Let's take our trust over IP model that everyone knows I love dearly. You guys are building a layer one essentially as a network dedicated for credentials with incentives built in, right? There's some questions coming up on why Cosmos and stuff. I'll come on to that in a minute actually, but so this is an Evening webinar, right? But I think you said you're working with others. We're happy for you to name them, right? It's not just an Evening, it's not just let's use Verity and the mobile SDK, et cetera, right? So Fraser, you're talking to everyone in the SSI world, I imagine. So feel free to talk more about that.
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of points to touch on, both on what you just asked there, and also kind of an extension to Anka's answer. So like we are very much staying at layer one, but we're also looking to make this as easy as possible for end customers to consume. And that kind of means working with the likes of yourselves and the other SSI vendors, the likes of like on testnet, say Sperity, Danube Tech, Loop. But then if we kind of also look at the other side of this, is making this as easy as to consume on the token side of stuff. And really what that means is also working with exchanges and working with custodians. And really where we're looking to get to it is that actually no one needs to worry about the underlying kind of infrastructure or the structure of it, because effectively there is a SaaS layer at the top, an API layer. Really everything is routing in and out of that seamlessly. So I think like obviously there's focusing on like the layer at the bottom, the network, using those commercial models, those payment rails, but also making sure that the partnerships are in place to make this as easy as possible to adopt for pretty much any organization. I think if it kind of goes back to our core hypothesis of why we exist, is like the commercial structures and the business models have like not been built yet to make SSI successful, but we need to make it, and therefore to make it adopted and to make it as easy as possible, like we need to know all the pain points to get to that adoption. So really that's the focus, is like tying all of it in together into one solution, even if it's made from different component parts, so that it's just easy to spin something up, either an individual or an entire.
Yeah, cool. Again, bit sketchy on the old Wi-Fi. There's better Wi-Fi on the Isle of Skye than London, Fraser. You need to get that sorted out. So there's some other questions coming in, which is great. I just want to come back to this, where you're playing there. So really clearly playing at layer one, you're creating a DID method. So anyone like us at Evening who are building software for layer 2 and 3, which is the DIDCOM layer and the credential exchange layer, we call a different DID method, and we have to have some token voodoo in there for doing some other stuff, right? And I want to come onto the token stuff in a minute, but that's essentially where you're playing, right? Is that bottom layer DID method with a bunch of tools to allow the incentives to work properly.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. Let's just come on to some that have come in. Steve, just on that topic, actually. Well, yeah, let's ask Steve ones first. So, Steve McGinnis, how do you plan to translate to and from fiat? That's a nice one, isn't it?
And I think that's where it's that relationship with the custodians and with the exchanges and say OTC desks, and like obviously that's going to be, the price will be set somewhat by the market, but the kind of extension of this is the token that we're building out may not necessarily be the kind of medium of exchange, so just like, which is kind of a term that you see floating around, because ultimately when we're setting credential prices or verification prices, we want those to be stable in fiat terms. And therefore, we may be looking at, say, either using stable coins, we may be looking at using CDBCs, or we may also be looking at kind of pegging around fiat to make sure that when a credential price is set, it's relatively stable so that it can be trusted. So obviously, like, we're looking into potentially segregating those roles out. So there is kind of the underlying token to secure the network, to go through governance, to even potentially create credit limits, but also look at alternatives to make sure that the actual transfer of value is very. So I guess to come back to it, there's the mix of working with exchanges to find the right price for tokens, but also kind of segregating out to make sure that we're achieving kind of stable prices for credentials and stable payments. Anko, I think you've got something to add after that.
Yeah, and to just sort of like, we call this the Elon challenge, which is if we built this on Ethereum and we've got like if you're making payments in ETH, then what happens if Elon Musk tweets tomorrow and the gas prices shoot up, or like there's more congestion on the network? And one thing we recognize is like if the economics of it is not going to be very stable, if the cost of an ID check today is £1 and tomorrow it's £150 because of something completely unrelated to SSI use demand that's happening in NFTs. So which is one of the reasons why when we look at like denominating this, we went down the route of, should we create a stable space coin, which is how do we create a medium of exchange that is stable, and that might still like actually be applicable in certain scenarios, or do we just use a stable coin? And the further we went down the route of like, say, payments are only made in aggregate, you can even then start looking at, do you actually need to carry out those payments? Maybe you can net them out. So if there's incoming and outgoing payments, you net it out, and the balance maybe on a regular basis is settled out in an actual stable coin like USDC, which is pegged against the dollar. And by looking at a mechanism like that, we think there are very stable mechanisms in which perhaps the price of a credential can be expressed in a stable dollar value. Doing microtransactions in USDC is very expensive. So in fact, it gives an incentive to not do the micropayment and not correlate it back to an individual, and like sort of almost forces you to go down the aggregate route. And I think realistically, we'll have different methods or mechanisms of payment, but we see that's how we can have the fiat to crypto pricing. Last bit that I'd add there is like, having worked in the enterprise space for a while, both me and Fraser know that blockchain often scares a lot of different enterprises. So we are working on making, for instance, can we have answers or integrations with custodians, cryptocurrency exchanges, so perhaps they never have to think about the crypto happening in the background, they just pay in fiat.
Yeah, I think getting that combination of the decentralized nature of crypto with things like smart contracts and incentives and linking credentials to payments, that's where the sweet spot is, and you can't do that with anything else. You can't just do it with fiat, for example. Let's come on to use cases, actually. So we've gone up here. There's this need for incentives for SSI networks to make them work. Then we've gone down into, okay, there's this ledger one layer that you're building in a network. And let's come up to use cases. So what's your top 2 or 3 use cases, Fraser, that you think this network's going to be used for day one when it becomes available?
Good question. So I think we've got kind of 2 hypotheses, and one of them speaks to our, I guess, partnership strategy. So what we've kind of noticed in the SSI world is that vendors like yourselves have typically captured an industry or a market or a country, and therefore actually there's an opportunity there to make ourselves the right home for just, like I said, kind of zero value credentials, for just credentials in general. But I think there are specific kind of industries where we are looking at use cases which really have like high value, or the payments are going to make a drastic increase to this. a lot of people talk about KYC. I think that's probably going to be there, but it's highly regulated and people have been trying to crack it for a long, long time. I think actually one of the big areas is probably kind of HR and looking into kind of career credentials. Like myself and Anchor through our history at Accenture and probably yours before, Andy, was like we were moving between companies pretty regularly and we'd get our kind of documents checked pretty regularly as well. And yet whenever we were between clients, we'd go through the same process and the same check, even though it was the same organization doing that checking every single time. And actually it would be much more efficient and probably better from a margin perspective for that process to happen once. So actually kind of there's an upfront check, you make sure everything is valid and current. You might do periodic checks to kind of make sure that nothing has changed, but actually you can issue those credentials almost at one time and then start to recoup that value kind of over the longer term. And I think that's one of the key ones. It really kind of flips the dynamics.
Yeah.
It really flips the dynamics, like you were saying before.
Yeah, I think that whole space is ripe, and as we're seeing with the UK NHS, staff credentials are hugely important, massive savings to be made there. I think the KYC stuff is still really valid as well because verify once and use many times, particularly in the DeFi sort of area, I think is going to be really important. There's still a bunch of other questions coming in. Let's ask about Phil Graham, a digital staff passport use case there for you. Okay, so let's just pick out a couple of these here. So we've sort of talked about the Cosmos piece, haven't we, anyway, versus India and stuff. So I think we parked that one. That was from Vishal. Anonymous said, do you think there'll be a single super identity standard to rule them all, or will there be an area, e.g. for art, medicine, patent records, etc.? Will industry groups need to produce these themselves? Now, this goes right to your interlocking ecosystem thing, doesn't it? Who wants that? Anchor, Fraser, you're off mute first.
I was actually going to hand immediately over to Anchor because I think this fits in really well with something that he presented at IIW, which was around as soon as you have an argument for better standardization rather than less standards, you typically end up with more. And I think I'll hand over to him in a second, but I think where I see it kind of going is starting to see I guess focus areas. So like you've got the W3 DID spec, like you've got the VC spec, and actually see kind of breakdowns within those industries. It's rare that you see, for example, across ISO, like ISO very much focuses on specific areas and then leaves certain things to other organizations like the FHIR standard for medical records in the US. And I think we'll start to see more and more of that of kind of, there's a general structure that we should all abide by, but then it should break down even further, would be my hope. But I know, Anki, you've got some views on this, given what you've seen.
Yeah, I think it's important to ensure that it can be expressed in a readable fashion. The example that I gave in the UK with open banking is I can connect my bank to any fintech app and it just works. And it can even go across different apps. We don't have that kind of like interop in a large way currently within the SSI ecosystem. People don't want 50 different wallet apps. And actually from a very similar perspective as well, I don't necessarily think that, we aim to be building solutions for just our DID standard. I think it's very dangerous to go down the route of saying, our ledger is better than your ledger, or this DID method is better than your DID method, because the reality is people, as they go along life, will have credentials that are anchored on different DID methods, or even non-DID method mechanisms, or even traditional ID. The challenge to solve there is how do you make it portable, and how do you ensure that the ecosystem actors are compensated, including the holder sometimes. And I think that's the correct lens to approach it from. Yeah,
I think that's very valid. Being able to have ecosystems overlapping and incentives moving between them, I think that's going to be a massive win, because your potential volume and your potential market just increases exponentially with network effects. Okay, let's come on to another question. Well, let's just dive down back to layer one again. Daryl, hi Daryl, good to see you on again. Says cheqd is doing a good job of drumming up interest in the utility layer, layer one, by onboarding stewards for testnet. What's your plan for incentivizing developers? So let's cover developers first, and then I want to ask about node operators as well. So developers, how are you going to incentivize them to do cool stuff?
Well, I think we've actually seen some of this already, and it partly speaks back to like what Anka was saying around the support for Indian kind of limitations. Like when you look into the Cosmos ecosystem, it's so wide and so varied that actually there's a great ecosystem there already, especially because across other ledgers and other tech, like there is a big reward system. Like if you're building into atoms, like you're kind of inherently part of the ecosystem. So you certainly if you're holding atoms, like you're directly responsible for almost increasing the utility and theoretically increasing the price. So there's a really big angle there. But I think there's probably two bits that we'd call out, and I'd love to hear Anka's thoughts after this. But I think one is kind of direct. So if we are looking at kind of specific functionality, specific features that we want to develop, but maybe it doesn't necessarily, or maybe it's kind of beyond the capacity that we have as a team, looking into leveraging kind of grants to achieve that. But also, and this should come out very soon, is Cosmos has the concept of a community pool. And the idea here effectively is that tokens are kind of distributed or allocated into a community pool over time. And the community could then decide where those tokens are allocated to. And I think that's kind of one of the big elements of where support for developers may come from, is that, yes, we may look into grants, but also there will be the ability for the community to decide where actually those tokens go as well. So I think there's some really good paths there. I think if I touch on the node operators, just to answer your question, I think the grant thing is something that we're actively operating on the node side, but I'll hand over to Anka to cover up, like, if there's anything else he wants to add on the developer side.
Short and crisp it is people differentiate on value-add services. That's why we have multiple exchanges, multiple SSI vendors. I think in terms of how people interact with the network, developers will differentiate themselves on pricing and margins and functionality they offer. So maybe like, developer, for instance, allows you company to pay for in fiat or receive in fiat without having to deal with crypto, and they charge for that service. So I think that's where we see the differentiation, a bit like how you have PayPal and Stripe and iZettle and SumUp, and like, even though it's commodity, even though it's card processing, there are multiple vendors that exist for it.
Yeah, so firstly, with Cosmos, you've got a much larger developer base anyway, full stop. And then secondly, you've got the ability to incentivize that developer base in ways that they're familiar with already. So that's the kind of wins that you're getting at with that Cosmos kind of ecosystem. So let's just go back to the node operators, right? If you're going to run a node on the cheqd network, it's a bit different to Sovereign, where it is altruistic and people do it for free, I assume. So firstly, do you need more node operators? How do you get to be a node operator? And if I was a node operator, what do I get? Do I get like a bottle of your vodka, Fraser, or what?
Yes, one of the 80 bottles of vodka from Threshers. So I think probably the first thing to say, I could touch on it earlier with Indy. Cosmos, the top end, at least inside the first year of validators, is around 100. On testnet, we're somewhere around 17 already. And we've only launched it maybe a month or so ago, or at least the revamp version. So kind of that number's shooting up already, but we would always prefer to be more decentralized, more geographically spread. So if there's anyone who's interested in this, please get in touch. Like Anka has done an excellent as spotted. And I hope. Yeah,
we lost you there,
so I guess, again, to extend it a bit further, kind of, Anka's done a great job in kind of making this as seamless as possible. I think then if we look into like the reward structure and how it's typically worked historically, I think there's two elements. One thing is we seem to have noticed that because of the way that the tech is structured, actually it's a lot cheaper to run in the first place than, say, an indie node is. So even on a pure cost basis, it's actually quite a lot lower, which caught me by surprise, but is a very nice one to have. But really the switch is that there are kind of token grants available. So we are looking at those for kind of preferred organizations that we would love to have on the network. So please get in touch for if you believe you're one of those people. And Toby, our head of partnerships, would love to kind of hear from you. But also because of the way the network is running around proof of stake, there is actually kind of a token reward off the network as well. And the beauty of this is since the kind of identity rights will be priced in tokens, it almost becomes a virtuous cycle of you're kind of getting rewards off the network to then go and use on the network as well. So it has a really nice benefit of like having rewards come off it, but also really reducing the cost of what it takes to put identity transactions through on volume.
Yeah, and presumably, like indie-based stuff, you're not writing loads of stuff to the ledger anyway, right? It's just issuer verification keys and that kind of thing, I would imagine.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think we've had a few questions historically of like how we compare to, say, the Kilts and maybe Everest and a few others. And I think that's really where we probably put ourselves head and shoulders above. Is like we really are honoring like the privacy, the GDPR side, and the standards basis. So there's nothing on the ledger that shouldn't be.
Yeah, well, that's good to hear. Let's come on to this question from anonymous attendee as well, which is another cracker. For a viable ecosystem to exist, who are the necessary and sufficient actors and the necessary and sufficient relationships between them? Who else is needed in the ecosystem of ecosystems to make it possible? So this is a really good question, and what I normally, I'm not going to put words in your mouth, but when I normally answer questions like that, I start off with a trust over IP framework, and I say, well, there's a stack here for human governance, right? Who sets the rules and that sort of thing. There's a stack for tech, the actual tech and what the tech protocols are. And there should be a stack for the business model and what the business model is at each layer, right? But you've got to have all of those elements of all of the stacks filled in to get an ecosystem. That's how I would answer that one. But this is your show, Fraser. How would you answer that?
I was just going to let you carry on with your answer because it felt like you were going to do the entire thing for us. That was my hope. I think there's kind of
services available at a very reasonable price.
18 liters of vodka from your nearest thrasher. So I think, like you're saying, it starts off with that triangle. I think you're then obviously historically you've had like the whoever is creating the governance framework, and I think we're kind of seeing a key role there of almost we're calling it ecosystem convener. So that could be a single organization, it could be a consortium, it could be kind of whatever structure you want. So I think that's another key individual there, is actually someone to pull the groups together. I think what's quite nice that we've seen is as a result of introducing commercials, it really changes the discussion and the nature of it, because people can see like a cost benefit or cost or benefit. They suddenly see an incentive to go and recruit other people. So we had a really interesting conversation a while ago, which was a point conversation with a single organization, single potential client. And it went from a single conversation to, oh, we'll go and grab everyone in our industry because actually we may as well all do this as one. And I think that's kind of the ecosystem convener role that we're really hoping for. It's like as soon as the money appears, we'll see these people come out of the woodwork.
That's a really good point. When you lay out the fact there is a business model, it goes from being a kind of, oh, here's a really cool bit of tech to, oh, here's a new P&L or something like that, right? So the ecosystem convener thing, just to explore that in a bit more detail, and for those people on, we're probably going to go another 5 to 10 minutes, okay? So I know there's a lot of people still staying on, which is great. So the ecosystem convener role, let's just kind of delve in. Can you give us some examples of who would be an ecosystem convener at the moment in the SSI world? I can think of two obvious ones right now, but who would you pick out, Anchor, as a current ecosystem convener in the SSI world, and what are they doing?
Phil Graham and remembering which date we met up in Manchester. But to set that aside, for instance, like, you know, if you have IATA is an ecosystem convener of airlines around the world. You have, say, the regulators for the UK Financial Conduct Authority might be a convener like that. And what's quite interesting is that the conveners might decide the trust framework within their own boundary, and then trust frameworks decide amongst each other which other trust frameworks' credentials do they allow or accept, and for what reasons and what purposes. And so I do often see it's likely the Glyphs and the IATAs of the world in the commercial construct that could be an ecosystem convener. And in other cases, it's likely to be government bodies and agencies that regulate a certain sector being those conveners. But I think over time, this becomes massively decentralized, and you start seeing things like DAOs as well. And then it becomes like, you know, a whole different ballgame of like how you convene different ecosystems.
Yeah, so your market essentially, you're marketing to ecosystem conveners, I guess, if we look at it in a sort of abstract way. You're saying, here's the engine for you to build your ecosystem and set the incentives for that ecosystem. Would I be right? So you can have loads of ecosystem conveners on cheqd, and they then sort their own ecosystem out. You don't have to do it for them. Is that pretty much where we're at?
That's definitely the aim, and it's just make their lives as easy as possible, and everyone that they work with as easy as possible. Speaking from experience, having created governance frameworks and having created or attempted to create commercial models, it takes a long time, especially where you have like a multi-stakeholder environment. And I think I've got, I see Alex Tweedale on the call as well. And one of the things that Alex has been fantastic at is actually creating that governance framework and beginning to template it out so that other organizations, other ecosystems, other industries could come along and leverage that same kind of framework, and just basically remove all of the like duplication of effort and turn it into a customization and configuration exercise. I think that's really what we're hoping is going to bootstrap and turbocharge adoption, because it's not only does it mean the network effects come into play, but actually it's suddenly a lot easier to adopt the technical wholesale. And we hope those two things will really kind of help the adoption grow.
Very cool, thanks for that. And there was a really good question again from Anon here. What parts of the ecosystem can or must be open sourced or closed source for an ecosystem? What's your open source plans?
So I mean, I think at the end of the day, we aren't really trying to compete with a lot of SSI vendors. Like, you know, what we want to see is we want to get the software in hands of as many people as possible. And also to Alex Tweedale, who's in chat, we are also trying to ensure that we don't control the network. So even in our governance principles, we are trying to build in a mechanism where we don't own control on such critical web infrastructure. I think the bits that become closed source or proprietary is what I said in terms of like perhaps like, you know, do you have the ability to maybe convert from fiat to crypto easily, or custodianship easily, or the things where there's a differentiation beyond the base level software. That's where I see like the ecosystem being closed source perhaps. And it's very similar to like, you know, how if you look at international money transfers right now, there's a standard, everybody can talk, everybody can pay each other using SWIFT, but then whether you're using this accounting software or that, you know, that's up for debate.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot, actually. You got the rails there under the skin, you got the privacy, you got the credential capability that we've kind of grown up with over the last few years and love, and you're layering on the business model and the ecosystem convener tools on top. I think we'll probably bring it to a close there. I've still got loads of attendees on actually, but time is pressing as usual. As usual, more questions than we could answer. I'd like to thank everyone who's contributed, and some really good ones as well. We just couldn't get to them all in the time we've got, unfortunately. I think that the thing that's come out of this for me is it's a bit like a coming of age for SSI, isn't it? It's moving from experimental. The question is no longer really kind of what are the bits and bytes.
It's not the technology.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a massive change, isn't it? It's going from, it's not all about the tech, it's about how do you roll it out at scale in a way that everyone can understand how it fits within their business. And the fact it's got to that point, I think is a massive positive vote for SSI. That people, they're asking the question, hence you guys exist, right? They're saying, how do I get this into my business? Fraser, any comment on that just to close off?
I think that's it. I think like the fact that myself and Anchor have seen, like it really did come to a tipping point of like, this is a problem 2 years, like, and it's becoming more of a problem, really led us to jump ship and go and do something about it. And I think what's been really refreshing since then is we've heard repeat. We've actually heard people kind of as unless there is a commercial behind this, we're not going to adopt SSI. They literally to the point of like, until I can put it into my prioritization of projects, it's not on my radar. And I think hearing about it talked in that way, especially for, but I think it's really reached that point. And it's also the elephant in the room happened recently, but kind of COVID really has accelerated that, like the shift to online, the shift of trying to find trust between individuals that you've never met before, removing branches potentially, and also kind of having additional restrictions and stuff. Like all of that being tied together has really moved it into like, this needs to happen now to be successful. I guess going back to your point, it's no longer the tech. Like we've not heard of a situation recently where the tech is the issue. It's very much like, how do I prioritize it against my other activities?
Yeah. So I think we probably got 2/3 of that phrase with dropouts and stuff. But yeah, I'll just come back to what I said earlier. I think it is symptomatic of a coming of age of SSI and a maturity of it. It's out of innovation land and into rollout with actual serious business cases around it. So I think we'll wrap it at that. I'm just seeing some other stuff come up on the chat. Thanks everyone for saying thanks. Really appreciate that. Jonathan, yes, this is recorded. The recording will go up on evanim.com/webinars. You'll be able to go back and have a look at it. And yeah, make sure you come on that next webinar of ours talking about the fracas at W3C about bids. John will give you the lowdown on that one as well. So evanim.com/webinars to register for that one. Really good to see everyone on, especially everyone who comes back. Keep coming back. We do like you coming back, and all the new people. Hope you enjoyed that. It really is a different look at the evolution of SSI to what we normally speak about on these webinars. So thanks for that. Sorry for the questions that are still coming in actually as well. If you guys want to try and answer any of those offline, that would be great. But again, thanks again to Fraser and to Anchor. Great webinar, guys. Go get your broadband fixed, Fraser, and we will see you all on the next one. Thanks very much indeed. Cheerio.